2. How, again, we reiterate, lest Jedi's scan this paper too quickly, the primacy of the aesthetic will be our primal directive. This point will be made in the context of a didactic polemic, through the refusal of much of philosophy's violent denial of the living, reasoning and feeling life of humanity, and of the possibility of a positive nature, one which is driven by empathy and the communal instinct. This hostility has been evident in the works, even, perhaps especially, of those who would assert the contrary, from Kant, who, wishing to free subjectivity from outside interest, betrays a fear of the sensual life in his rigid abstraction, or to the, albeit laudable, quest of Adorno, who, while desiring to free the world from tyrannical concepts, makes of the subject which it is his intention to free, a tabula rasa byproduct of economic conditions, and in seeking to free this arbitrary construction from the misuses and lies to which art and aesthetics are turned, despite his liberatory intentions, does so by prescription, by imposing his own rigid, ideological concept, in a dogmatic refusal to let human beings seek enjoyment, seeing art which people might just enjoy as inherently bourgeois. Meanwhile, he makes human nature a purely bourgeois construction. 5. Thus stamping out the positive unity toward which his breaking of false representation should positively aspire. Here we are set that Schiller, slighted in every account, painted a picture of the psyche and social existence which celebrated the subject, as well as social existence, in a manner which was inclusive of all facets of life. Centering his phenomenology in what Newman terms centroversion, Schiller avoids the rigid divisions of life into formal and sensual, rational and emotional, subjective internal and objective social life, resulting in a philosophy which gives respect to the subject, on the one hand, as a pre-social feeling and reasoning being, and at the same time, the subject's immersion in social existence. Western philosophers after Schiller will carry the blame for the simplistic, one-sided, unyielding divisions characterizing our intellectual world's conceptions of society, subjectivity, and human nature, which, seizing upon and amplifying, in isolation, singular facets of the totality of human experience, which Schiller treated synthetically and centered in the Kantian subject, and, in turn, denying the facets championed by others, engage in a war of illusions concerning the ding and sitch, and despite the fact that their impetus to liberation might be undertaken with the utmost sincerity, they violently tear apart the phenomenal world of the person. Not in a way which breaks down illusions and brings liberation, but in a way which denies and does violence to the human being. We shall insist upon a return to the integral wholeness, the inclusive humanism of Schiller's synthesis, and upon the pursuit, both in critical social theory, and the interpretive critical treatment of art and aesthetics, of modes of humanity's criticism which are humanistic. Only thus can we avoid the atrocious extremes of our fissured legacy, which have their end in a world divided, dismembered by the putrescent ideological trinity, that of the Völkisch universality within the confines of state, race and nation, that of the Stalinistic collective technocratic machine, universality under the yoke of omnipotent power, and of estrangement, individuality conceived as pure isolation, possessing no nature but that which pertains to the pursuit of profit. This will be done by seeking exemplars in the world of thought, who in the making, and in the criticism of art, and in the critical quest to alter our social conditions, do so in ways which respect and celebrate creative life, and the emotional, rational life of the subject, without which there is no subjective, nor any objective world to engage with, without whose existence, there is no point of critical reference, and no reason to care either way about subject or object, without whose subjective response and refusal of culture's directives, we are left without reason to condone or to criticize anything. In turn, such exemplary figures in elevating the subject never once lose sight of the social, outside of which the subject is free and alone, but lies heaving, often mistaking these last frantic flailings for true inspiration. Whereas the communist mistakes the fish for the surrounding water, and the fascist shark, devouring all of his comrades, claims to alone represent the beautiful and boundless sea, and yet again, the bourgeois fisherman lures us all shoreward, dangling morsels into the sunlight of alienation, promising lonely prosperity, casting us onto the seashore, where the nefarious fire of capital hungrily greets us, the licking flames laughing at our newfound freedom to be someone's dinner, where each and every one of these ways of making the world violently lays down its laws, always with the pretext of freedom. The humanistic exemplar wishes to let it exist, always maintaining a faith in life's life-giving potential, trusting that life, in all of its many created dimensions, being much older than any who live it can ever remember, ought to be trusted to go on without our violent enforcement. But, as we make this assertion, let us not let optimism turn into quaintness, let not the positive turn to naivete. It is true, if our inherited nature is a component, integral to the historical dialectical process, if such a nature is the mother of love and of kindness, if it is the basis of progress and social improvement, the force of Eros which subtly draws the heart into its springtime, yes, in admitting into our ontology a loving nature, we indeed also open ourselves to the spectre of genetic evil, and every terrible scapegoating use it has ever been put to. Let us first of all be clear, if there is such an evil, then it is one which is shared unequally by everybody. Let us, with constant vigilance, tear out the tongues of those sophists, popularizers of vulgar and philistine interpretations which turn the human capacity for cruelty into a mandate, brandishing high the fallacious flag of quad-estate debauchery, turning our greatest vehemence towards those who would make our worst traits, or even our best, the properties of one race or one nation, or an apologia for our present conceptions of gender, of power, and of the craving for consumer garbage. Having thus cast these demons back into the medieval, let us not be deluded about the human condition. With our capacity for love, empathy, and mutual aid comes the capacity also for cruelty and domination, for the irrational hatred of others, and for masochism. Neither these, nor the nurturing, life-seeking aspects of a human being are without their debt to the body, but it is the social life that we create around us which, in its ideological and its physical shaping of the subjective faculties, which, by their own creation, the social mind-body that lives in the space between myriad subjects, are in turn created, acted upon from outside. This creates, for the subject, conditions which are conducive either to the preponderance of our best or our worst nature. It is thus contingent upon the creative subject, whether in art, or in politics, or in everyday life, to always strive to create the conditions which bring forth the good. The creative exemplar, in representing the world, in the positive and honest celebration of life, is distinguished from the Pollyannas of quaintness, the hell of the sitcom Gemeinschaft, the Thomas Kinkades of the world, by the fact that they always keep, in clear visibility, all of the violence and sadness that lives with the joy of this world, in all of its hideous grandeur, all of history's murder. Always keeping in sight this violence and fragmentation, they do not stop, satisfied with merely dispelling the lie. Rather, they seek to snatch these violent, irrational forces back from the clutches of tyranny, war and human estrangement, putting them back in their natural place in the song of existence, as with Kropotkin, whose sometimes overly rosy view of human nature never once tries to deny the existence of violence and hatred, but rather to create a world in which these forces are always directed, not towards our fellow human beings, nor the earth which sustains us, but rather, always, relentlessly towards every form of power. towards everything which prevents us from living freely together, and in the poems of Tagore, in which death, dissolution and sorrow are the very conditions by which life in its beauty and continuity is renewed, and are seen as joyous. 9. As an exemplar in the field of musicology, there is no figure greater than that of Moses Ashe, whose folk cosmopolitanism embodies the ethic of Schiller's fourth letter, celebrating the universal through its subjective manifestation in the local, thus refusing all contradictions between the interests of the individual's culture, and those of the common body of humanity. As a phenomenological exemplar, we have Jung, whose psychology of individuation closely reflects Schiller's directive to transcend the oppositions of reason and sensuality through the free play of the faculties, and finally through the attainment of the aesthetic state, in which the contradiction between the drives is resolved in the synthetic third state. This is analogous to Yule's directive to unify inner and outer experience, and that of the conscious and unconscious aspects of the self. A very much longer and far more detailed edition of this work will extend this list in great biographical detail. As we are here constrained by the limits of time and space, we will constrain our survey to Kropotkin, Jung and Chagall. The first is a humanistic alternative to the abstractions and denials of the subject by Marxian theorists, whose program provides us with every bit as relentless a critique of the social order and its misdirection of human instinct as anything the critical school has ever produced, in a style the regular people, uneducated in jargon, can understand. Jung provides us with a psychological model for interpreting art and literature which assumes that the unconscious is a positive, prospective and purposive force and not the reductive waste dump of the Freudians. Finally, Chagall, as an artist brazenly walking the tightrope of errors between the jagged cliffs of the sublime and the beautiful, over the gaping abyss of the trite and never once stumbling, presents us with the exemplary picture of art as the expression of life in its absolute totality. The first two are theoretical exemplars, the latter practical and certainly not to be understood as the only way to make art. The Schillerian synthesis of the faculties, like the Aristotelian mean, cannot be achieved through prescription, but is relative to the contingencies of place, time and subject. Chagall, making no distinction between his sentimental Gemeinschaftsschaffung for his native Vitebsk, and his feelings of total unity with the whole world, is one example of how an individual can achieve this in his or her life and historical context. After a brief elaboration on the basic principles of Jung and Kropotkin, this work will end with an analysis of the works of Chagall, as well as some other artists who have dealt with similar motifs, attempting to demonstrate that culture, history and nature are neither arbitrarily constructed nor simply inherited, but are constituted by an infinitely complex play of structural continuity with contextual and individual idiosyncrasy and anomaly. And that the universal is constituted by the shared nature of variant particulars, thus rendering the distinction arbitrary and false.